When you think of figures who changed the course of history, a few big names probably come to mind. Well, today, we're diving into the story of one of the most powerful and controversial leaders of the 20th century, Mao Zedong. And that brings us to the central question of our story. How did just one person manage to completely transform a country with hundreds of millions of people? It's a huge question, so let's get into it. The man at the center of it all was Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic of China. You really can't understand modern China without understanding his story. Okay, first up, from farmer to revolutionary. To really get who Mao became, you have to look at where he came from. Those early years were absolutely crucial. So, Mao was born back in 1893, and his family were farmers. This meant he grew up working the land, so he knew firsthand just how tough life was for most people in China. But here's the thing, he wasn't just working in the fields. He absolutely loved to read. We're talking history, philosophy, all the big ideas. And that mix, well, it was powerful. He had the real-world experience of poverty and these huge ideas from his books swirling in his head. As he was reading, Mao was looking for an answer to China's biggest problem, incredible poverty. And he found this idea called communism. So what is it? The basic theory is that instead of private ownership, all property, like land and factories, is owned by everyone, by the public. Everybody works, and in theory, everybody gets what they need. The big goal is to get rid of that massive gap between the super rich and the super poor. For a young guy like Mao, this sounded like a powerful solution. So he didn't just read about it. He decided to do something. In 1921, Mao and a handful of other thinkers got together and started the Chinese Communist Party. And you gotta understand, at this point, they were nobody. Just a tiny group with a massive, almost impossible goal: to completely remake China from the ground up. So let's move on to how they forged a new China, through all the struggles that led them to power. The question is, how on earth does this tiny little party end up running the whole country? Well, it wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't quick. Here's a quick look at the major moments. The party starts in 1921. But look, they don't actually take power until 1949. That is a long, hard road. And a huge defining event in that whole period was something called the Long March. 6,000 miles. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that. That's like walking from New York to LA and back. And this wasn't some fun hike. Starting in 1934, it was a desperate retreat. Mao and his army were on the run, trying to survive. They crossed brutal mountains and raging rivers, all while being attacked. Thousands died, but the ones who made it through, they were completely dedicated to the cause. And to their leader, Mao. So after all those years of fighting a bitter civil war, they finally win. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stands in Beijing's Tiananmen Square and says these famous words: "The Chinese people have finally stood up." For his supporters, this was everything. It was the moment they felt China was finally free from foreign control and could stand on its own 2 feet. All right, our next part, the Great Experiments. Now that Mao was in charge, he didn't just want to govern China. He wanted to totally reinvent it. He launched these gigantic, nationwide experiments to transform the country, and fast. And the changes came right away. Boom, land was taken from rich landlords and handed over to the poor farmers who actually worked it. They passed new laws that gave women rights they'd never had before, like owning property. They even banned arranged marriages. Plus, they started this huge push to teach everyone how to read and write. The whole point was to completely tear down the old way of life. But Mao had even bigger plans, especially for the economy. In 1958, he kicked off something he called the Great Leap Forward. And the name says it all. The plan was to launch China from a farming nation into a modern industrial power, basically overnight. So how are they going to do this? The key idea was the commune. They took the entire countryside and reorganized everyone into these giant groups. We're talking thousands of people living together, working together, sharing everything. Food, tools, you name it. Your private family life pretty much disappeared. It was all for the good of the group, for the Great Leap. Well, the plan was ambitious, but the reality, it was an absolute catastrophe. For example, farmers were told to stop farming and start making steel in little furnaces they built in their own backyards. The steel turned out to be totally useless. And because nobody was tending the fields, food production just collapsed. This led to a massive, horrific famine, one of the worst in human history. Millions and millions of people starved to death. Next up, revolution turns on itself, and the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. You see, after the complete disaster of the Great Leap Forward, people started to question Mao's leadership. And his response? He started something even more extreme that would turn Chinese society completely upside down. In 1966, Mao called on all the young people of China. He told them to rise up and destroy what he called the Four Olds. That's old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Officially, this was about keeping the revolution pure. But really? It was also a brutal way for Mao to crush his rivals and grab back absolute power. And who answered this call? Millions of students and other young people. They were known as the Red Guards, and they weren't just followers, they were fanatics. They basically worshipped Mao and became the ruthless enforcers of this whole movement. And what the Red Guards did plunged the entire country into chaos for a decade. They shut down schools to focus on politics. Students attacked their own teachers. They went on rampages, destroying ancient temples, priceless art, and historical books. People were dragged out into the streets, publicly humiliated and shamed for not being revolutionary enough, even by their own children. It was a complete breakdown of society. And for our final section, Mao's enduring legacy. After 10 years of this turmoil, the Cultural Revolution finally started to wind down, mainly because Mao himself was getting old and sick. His death marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a huge debate about what he left behind. So, in 1976, Mao Zedong died. He had ruled China for 27 years. And with him gone, nobody was quite sure what was going to happen to the country next. This is where things get really complicated, because when people look back at Mao, they see two very different things. On one hand, he's credited with pulling China together after a century of conflict and foreign control. People say he created the unified, strong China we see today. But then there's the other side. His policies, like the Great Leap Forward, caused immense suffering and famine. The Cultural Revolution destroyed culture and tore families apart. All told, his rule resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of his own people. Which leaves us with a really tough final question. How should we remember a leader who both built a nation and, in many ways, broke it? There's just no easy answer. It's a complicated legacy that people are still debating to this very day.